Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of News from a World in Flux. I'm Clare Farrell.
Charlie Gardner.
Today we're going to have a sort of a deep dive, if you like, into the topic of 1.5. Obviously, we've been in conversation about this many times on this show, but there's definitely something sort of critical about the idea of it, the communication of it, the fact that it's become a sort of a significant piece of the sort of communication space on climate, and a lot of people have criticised that. It's deeply unhelpful framing. Doesn't sound like a lot for a start. It's quite difficult for people to understand. Also, we're seeing increasing recognition that we've blown through it recently. So start us off, Charlie. 12 months of beyond 1.5 recognition earlier this year it feels like it's not had the focus that it should.
No, absolutely not. So yeah, given that we've been talking about keeping global heating to 1.5 as a global target for a long time now, it was really stunning how little coverage there was when it was announced in June this year that we'd now gone 12 consecutive months where the global average temperature had been at least 1.5 above pre-industrial temperatures. And so yeah, I think you're right that it was really shocking there was no coverage of that fact, but it was also weird that there was no explanation of what that means, because of course the Paris Agreement target is to pursue efforts to keep us to 1.5, and yet here we are, the global data set is saying we've passed 1.5. So is the Paris Agreement target dead? It turns out that we haven't actually passed 1.5 long term yet because of interannual variation. So there's year-on-year variation. Some years are warmer than others, regardless of the background trend of heating. So the last year has been the first year that we've reached the 1.5 target, but it doesn't mean we're definitively over it, because basically the way you could tell if we've reached 1.5 long term is you would expect an average of half years would be above 1.5 and half the years would be below. This is just the first year we've hit there. So we haven't actually reached there long term. When you look at the long-term trend, it's probably the case that we're still on 1.3 degrees of heating, so we haven't passed 1.5 yet, but obviously we're really close.
Well, and just hold on that thought for a minute, because if 1 year of having gone past could be 50-50, half the year you're over 1.5, half the year you're not, we've had a whole year where you are.
That's not, yeah, I must have explained badly. My point was, if we're on an average of 1.5, you would expect 50% of the years to be below 1.5 and 50% of the years to be above it. And that's how you know you're dead on it.
So you mean for like a decade or something is what you're talking about as a sort of time span? You don't analyse that across a decade, because I think this is one of the difficult points I find when I'm dealing with scientists and trying to be a communicator to the world, is that so much of the sort of the scientific language of qualifying everything that you say is, like we've discussed, the reason we started doing this in the first place, to sort of interrogate the IPCC reports and work out what they're really saying, because the language can be quite impenetrable. And one of the problems, I think, is that if, for scientific accuracy's sake, we then have to say, well, we're not really past 1.5, but we have been for 12 months, it's extraordinarily difficult to then leave the average person not going, I don't know what the fuck they're talking about, because it doesn't make sense to the average sort of set of ears who aren't used to sort of looking beyond the scientific like use of language, the sort of specific way that language gets used. It's the same, I think, with the weather. You know, there's a massive, very destructive storm and it will say, this was made blah, blah % more likely by climate change. Doesn't actually tell the person listening that it's being caused by climate change and that destruction wouldn't have happened without it. And it feels like that's another point of like difficulty, saying, well, you know, what do you mean? Is it or isn't it? And it's the weakness of the scientific methodology and philosophical basis, in a way, which has always been the access point for the deniers, for the delayers to go, yeah, but you're not sure, are you? You're not sure. It relates to that, doesn't it? Because if you can't ever say anything with certainty, because in the spirit of good science, you only think that that's correct until someone manages to prove you wrong, and that's the point of being good, then you're left with this linguistic sort of failure in the communication space, aren't you?
Yeah, and absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And it really, really hits hard when we talk about uncertainty, because the public conception of uncertainty and the scientific meaning of uncertainty are completely different things.
Yeah.
If a scientist says, there's, I'm reluctant to say that this will definitely happen because there is still some uncertainty, what that scientist means is that I'm 99% certain this is going to happen, but I'm not going to say it's going to happen because I'm only 99% certain. When the public hears that scientist say it's not certainly going to happen, they might think there's a 50-50 chance, not a 99 to 1. So they mean, and it's a real problem because we have left the communication to scientists, and we do it badly. And not only because of that language issue, but also we've been trained to be dispassionate. We've been trained that the only thing that matters is facts, and our emotions, you have to get your emotions out of the picture. Emotions are bad. So we end up saying things like, this is a really, really terrifying situation, or whatever, you know. You say, we're trying to communicate to people that the situation is really alarming, but we're doing it in a voice that doesn't carry any alarm. And so it just fails on a really basic psychological level. If someone's telling you something is scary and they don't sound scared, then you won't believe them that it's scary. And so it's a real problem that we've left the communication to scientists for so long. And there's no greater proof of that than Greta Thunberg, who, you know, as soon as one person started speaking in emotive language and started telling it like it is, not talking about the facts, but the implications of those facts, then it really cut through on a massive level, and people started listening because she communicated with the urgency that this does need to be communicated with. So anyway, the concept of 1.5 is complex and it's badly communicated, and it could have negative impacts, you know, as a result of the way it is communicated. You know, the thing is, regardless of whether we're at 1.3 or 1.5 or 1.7, it doesn't make any difference to what we need to do, which is absolutely change everything as quickly as possible. And that remains the case whether we've not yet hit the target yet or not. I worry that when you're saying, oh, we haven't yet hit the target, does it carry sort of, this is fine connotations, like, things aren't that urgent because we're still within... It's
that dog in the burning room, isn't it, going, this is fine. It feels it's like the most perfect sort of meme that you can apply to almost any part of the climate conversation.
Every part of it.
What I think is also interesting about this 1.5 being breached for 12 consecutive months of analysis earlier this year is that I think that was also part of the agreed facts of the trial of the Whole Truth 5, wasn't it?
It was, yeah.
You know, that was an extraordinary thing to witness, basically, that the Crown prosecution, the CPS, the the entire sort of state infrastructure, if you like, as it comes into this like moment in the justice system in the courtroom, is basically saying we agree that we've gone past 1.5 for 12 months in a row because the information is there, it's on public record, and probably some of this information is like state produced information that's been, they can't discount it because it's been made by the state.
It comes
right?
from the World Meteorological Organization, and they get their data from governments.
Yeah. So there's that, and then there was like, breaching 1.5 degrees is extremely dangerous and should never happen, and existential threat, and and unfolding like guaranteed disaster. And at the time of this action, or the Zoom call, whatever's in question, there was also, a government in place that was opening up new rounds for licensing on more oil and gas from the North Sea. And, somehow all of those things were allowed to be agreed by the defence and the prosecution, put down as the agreed facts of the case. And then the activists were tried in a manner which said, those agreed facts, though, are not relevant to this case because they're about something else. They're not about your Zoom call. They're about the conditions of some other world where, and a judge recently said this as well, the climate crisis, which may or may not be taking place, is not relevant to the discussion in this courtroom. So, again, this feels like it's, in some ways, it's perhaps a big problem that the public don't understand what the fuck you mean when you talk about 1.5 and breaching it, because not only are they going to be told in a courtroom that is a fact, which may just do nothing to them because they don't know what it means, they don't emotionally engage with it, and then they're going to be told to ignore it anyway. Yeah. So I just thought it's fascinating how this is supposed to be a key metric for us all to look at, and for negotiations, and for people to be working towards whatever. Personally, I think it's fucked, and I think it was fucked a long time ago. Then we're going to wait for the scientists for like a decade to eventually go,
you're right.
Oh no, you've definitely gone past it now. But by the time they do that, it will be at like 2 point something.
Yeah.
And they'll go, well, this month it's 2 point something. But we've definitely gone past 1.5 now.
Across all aspects of our society, we've got this thing where we prioritise knowing over doing always, and it's a real issue in my field, in conservation science. Like, to this day, you see huge amounts of amazing research coming out, like loads of effort, loads of money gone into it, just measuring how bad the problem is. It's like, mate, we need to go beyond that. We know we have a biodiversity crisis. Can we really focus on action now and doing something about it? But it's we've got a bit of a problem in that the field that told us that we have these problems is science, and science is about measuring and detecting. It's not really about solving. Solving is a real world problem, not so much a research problem. Because you might need, you need research to develop a solution, but even then, implementing the solution is not a scientific problem, it's a political and social one, right? So with climate change and nature, because it's scientists that have told us, scientists have told us we have a problem, and they've said, right, society really, really needs to act now. And instead of acting, society just carries on listening to the scientists that told us about this problem, but it's not science that's going to implement the solutions. That's for the rest of us as members of society to bring society along with us, to make society change. And we see that same relationship with these global governance structures. Rather than getting busy with doing what needs to be done, people still remain enthralled to the voices of the scientists. And it's a problem.
Well, and it's also that sort of old problem in movements, I think, and probably like more broadly often on the sort of progressive left, as you might call it, that, if everyone just knew what I knew, then they'd agree with me, right? And then we'd like do all the right things. It's not an information deficit problem.
It's not, no.
But so When we were chatting earlier about the announcement about all of the investment in the UK in carbon capture, and obviously that's been a massive news story, there's a few things here that relate, I think, a lot to stuff that we've probably touched on a little bit before, but not that much. One of them is like overshoot. We can overshoot 1.5 and then go back. I can't pinpoint the moment when I first heard that narrative.
It was when the IPCC report came out, I think, is when I heard it.
Yeah, but it was a surprise to me. And then it was an even bigger surprise that sort of the establishment voices all seem to have adopted it already, as if it was like always a given that was probably what we would do, as if you can magically go backwards, which, as far as I'm looking at the evidence I've examined, is completely ridiculous story to tell ourselves. But then also we talked about the Paris Climate Agreement and the wording of that 1.5 piece. So can you just talk to me a bit about what the Paris Agreement accurately states about 1.5 and perhaps what that might show us about how readily this narrative of overshoot and going and reversing things?
Sure. So I'm just going to check my computer because I want to make sure I get this precisely right, because the wording is very precise. So the target of the Paris Agreement, it talks about holding the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and pursuing efforts to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And I've always been a bit confused by this wording, pursuing efforts. It sounds very vague. It's not a target, is it? It's like, we'll try. And I always thought what it meant was, we'll definitely aim for 2 degrees, but we'll try to aim for 1.5. Thinking about it now, I wonder if what it actually meant was, we'll definitely aim for 2 degrees, and we'll never let go of the aim. We will always pursue efforts to get it back down to 1.5 because of this idea that we can reverse it, as you say. So yeah, the last assessment report of the IPCC introduced this concept of overshoot, this idea that we could exceed 1.5 and then bring temperatures back down. As you say, it's completely nonsensical for, I think there are two very, very real reasons why we can't ever assume that we can bring it back down. One is that it relies very heavily on negative emissions technologies, carbon capture and storage, which, I mean, we'll talk about that in a minute, but it doesn't exist. So, it's quite a big deal to pin your hopes on the future on technologies that don't exist. But the other thing, of course, is that we risk setting in place runaway processes, tipping processes, because there's lots and lots of carbon stored in soils, in forests, in nature, and everywhere else. As the temperature increases, we're seeing major impacts. Forests are burning, soils are drying out and releasing carbon, and all that carbon is being released into the atmosphere. So it might not ever be possible to bring it back down to below 1.5 because of tipping points that we pass along the way. Another well-known tipping point that we talk about all the time is the loss of sea ice. Now, that's not about carbon, but it is about temperature. As the sea ice melts, you're getting a lot less heat is reflected straight back, and instead it's absorbed into the ocean. So, the risk is, as temperature increases, all of these planetary tipping processes might be triggered, which means we'll never ever be able to get it back, even if the carbon capture and storage technology did work. But the thing is, it doesn't, or at least it doesn't work at scale so far. So carbon capture and storage technology, people have been working on it for a long time, for decades, and there are existing plants out there in the world that are out there trying to do direct air capture, suck carbon out of the sky. And
just to be clear, you mean plant as in
oh, sorry,
a built
factories.
factory?
yeah. So because we all know that is plants do actually do that. But so yeah, there are carbon capture facilities. They have successfully captured some carbon out of the air. But when you tot it all up, it's like it's a couple of minutes of global emissions. It's literally a drop in the ocean. It's nothing. So we don't have this technology. We'll talk about it again. But there's just one thing I think that even if the carbon capture technology worked, it's still problematic if what we're doing is continuing emitting and then sucking it out of the atmosphere. In fact,
continuing growing emitting.
Yes, yeah.
Right? Because I saw somebody the other day doing a presentation from the sustainability team at Heathrow Airport. And it was very insightful to see how they present the future of the aviation industry.
Okay.
And, one part was about making it more efficient, which of course I was like, bullshit. Like, everything you make more efficient, you do more and it gets worse. It's called the efficiency paradox. Everyone knows about it. It's a major, major problem in the heart of the sustainability discourse, because if you say that efficiency is good, when efficiency always leads to using more resources, it's not fucking good, is it? So what are we doing about that? The other things were about, sustainable aviation fuel and, being able to sort of, I think, basically using like biofuel, which then you will claim as net zero, and which showed you like a growth trajectory for the aviation industry, and how with the implementation of all of these things, you were going to reduce the footprint of the entire industry. And, he was saying all these things that you would find very convincing if you didn't spend as much time looking at these things as people like us do. Like, obviously people want to fly because travel is an innate good. Meeting other people, connecting cultures, people have got to see their families, people have to fly for love. I mean, all of this kind of, very amazingly polished, compelling stuff. But the truth was that there was very little room in that conversation to just talk about doing it less.
Less flying, yeah.
And, that's the growth imperative, which is like driving all of this stuff. The recent announcement to expand City Airport and blah, blah, blah. It just keeps on going, doesn't it? And the Starmer story is growth, growth, growth. I'm here for growth. I'm going to do that. And I don't know, there is some success in that sort of frame at the moment for Britain, if you see what I mean. Like, the economy has changed tack a little bit. They do look like they're sort of, doing them. They're getting some progress on that. But if all of this tech can only, let's imagine it could work and it could be plopped on top of all of the problematic industries, concrete, fossil fuels, everything, and people started to roll all of that out, but you still carry on trying to increase all of them and grow them and grow them and grow them, then it's very simple to look at that situation and say, well, that's not going to help you reduce emissions. That's going to help you stall the growth of them, right? Whilst you grow activity, but you don't grow the emissions, which is just going back to an ancient conversation from the climate space about decoupling emissions from growth, which is, I thought we'd done that one quite a long time ago, but it's right at the heart of this, isn't it?
It really is, yeah. So all the discussions that are on the table and really being, all the solutions that are being discussed and being financed aren't actual solutions to the problem. They are sort of quasi-solutions that allow us to continue what we're doing. And so basically, people aren't looking at proper solutions. They're looking at things that sound like they'll help, but will allow economic activity to carry on as unchanged as possible. And it's a bit of a confidence trick, I think. It's a con. So, you talked about aviation. We had, I think it was about a year ago now, there was the first transatlantic flight that was run entirely on what they call sustainable aviation fuel. And it was one flight, right? Even if the fuel was sustainable, it was one flight. But it was really, really well publicized. So it was on all the news, it was everywhere. So now everybody has heard that news, has heard that it is possible to fly across the Atlantic on sustainable fuel. And it's just planted this idea in the public consciousness that actually it is possible to fly sustainably. And I think that's as much the part of it, the point of it. It buys you time because it plants this idea. And it's exactly the same with the carbon capture and storage announcement that we had in October in the UK. Every radio station, everyone carried this big announcement. The government is spending £20 billion on giant factories who are going to suck the carbon out of the sky. And so everybody's reassured now. Everybody's right. Oh, the government is on the case. Oh, there are solutions. Yeah. Oh, there's no need for me to, to become an activist or anything, because actually the government are on the case now. And it's really, really dangerous.
So one thing I want to say about this carbon capture story as well, politically speaking, is that our Prime Minister, following in the great tradition of the Conservative Party writing total shit in The Sun, published an opinion piece which was like, I won't be forced into, things by the net zero extremists, and Extinction Rebellion will tell me that this investment is wrong, but, I'm putting industry first. And certainly and then goes and reels off a list of people that basically forcing that frame that the trope that people like us are the enemy of the working class. He lists brickies, people who make concrete, people who work in the glass industry, and it's an extreme, first of all, it's a very masculine conversation. It's very much like, I need to protect industrial jobs. And I was like, there's something about all of this investment, industrial machinery, everything that feels like it's a sort of, it's a macho frame, first of all. Yeah, and it's and there's always that sort of similarity between that and when you've seen the tabloids saying you've stopped white van drivers and they're the beating heart of the economy and that means that you're the enemy of the working people, blah, blah, blah. The implication is usually men, you're the enemy of men. I'm interested in that because I think that at the moment, whilst we see extreme misogyny, the rise of Andrew Tate, Donald Trump, the things that feel very much like they sort of edge us towards fascism, far-right politics, Tommy Robinson even, all of that stuff is protect our women and girls. I'm get off me, mate. Yeah. I'm not yours. Do you know what I mean? And somehow, for me, the fact that your Prime Minister feels the need to write basically a spin doctor's op-ed that sounds like something that could have come straight out of Tufton Street in order to set us with our sort of damaged identity, reputation in society, because they've been vilifying people like us for such a long time, to put us versus industry and people having jobs is precisely the most irresponsible thing that you can do right now, to set climate action versus jobs as that's the frame. And I think it's disgusting. I think it's irresponsible. And I really, really hope that people are going to further the conversation about what he's doing as a leader, because that's not leadership, actually, turning people against each other, carrying on the culture war and politicising an issue which needs broad support, needs a spectrum of action. It needs everyone to collaborate. And for me, that, you know, it's just politically despicable, basically.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, it's all those things and more, but of course it's also very deliberate. And that's what's worrying for me, because this is a narrative, this has been a sort of divide and rule tactic that's been used against environmentalists for decades. To say nature or jobs, right?
Yeah.
It's ages old. And the fact that he has gone for that narrative, I think, is a really worrying sign about how serious any of his intentions about decarbonisation are. The other thing, of course, is that it's utter bullshit. It's complete nonsense. So one thing that's not said about this £22 billion investment is that it requires the building of new gas plants. So they're not retrofitting carbon capture onto existing gas plants. They're going to build new gas plants. In other words, these are new fossil fuel projects masquerading as climate projects.
Licensed to grant more licenses, basically.
And while it is true, it will create some jobs. You know, these are two factories going up in two places, in Teesside and I think Liverpool was the other one, or Manchester. Whereas if it was £22 billion spent on a nationwide programme to retrofit housing with insulation and heat pumps, that would be proven reductions in emissions instead of magical, we hope, reductions in emissions, because that actually works. It would be much more emissions would be prevented. It would mean reduced reliance on gas instead of increased reliance on gas, which is what the carbon capture does. It would mean people having lower fuel bills, living in warmer houses, getting less ill and less pressure on the NHS. And of course, it would mean a lot more jobs, because it wouldn't just be, 1,000 jobs in this factory and 1,000 jobs in this factory. It would be workforces around the country being retrained into the industries of the future to retrofit our entire housing stock. So, in terms of an investment on climate, retrofitting our houses would tick 5 or 6 boxes that the carbon capture doesn't. But just this idea that we are anti-jobs is just nonsensical, because there are other policies that carbon capture and storage is just a bad policy on every level, and that's it's nothing to do with us. We're not anti-jobs. We advocate for a just transition.
I mean, that was one of the most exciting things actually about when you spoke to the people in Insulate Britain, when that was, when that campaign was in full flow. I spoke to a bunch of people about the research they'd done, which was actually a fabulously exciting story, like the one you just told. Do the analysis, how much would it cost and how many people would have to be employed to be able to retrofit the entire social housing stock by 2030. And then from the social housing stock, you then go on and you make sure that you carry on dealing with the rest. And because we don't have enough people trained who could do that work at that scale, you'd have to build a whole workforce. You'd have to do tons of retraining for people. You'd have to build supply chains that don't exist for the types of materials we need, because you'd need more of them than what can be produced or what we can import or whatever. And so to me, it was this really exciting story that you could create around having a national task force that goes out and says, right, we need to do a good job of this, not a shit job, which has also been a problem of government insulation schemes, where things have been injected into buildings and then has to get ripped out, and people can't sell their homes. I mean, that is also a massive mess. But the idea that you would have a kind of a constructive plan as a nation for everyone's going to roll their sleeves up and get to work and do the thing that keeps your grandma warm and saves your grandkids all in one big story. I mean, it's a no-brainer, like massive win-win solution. And at that time, I think we maybe had Boris Johnson in government, and I met somebody who was talking about how, you know, home insulation has been something that people in think tanks and climate negotiations have been trying to push forwards in this country for like probably most of my life whilst I've been here on the planet, and it doesn't get beyond the Treasury, right? So it goes into the process. People go, yeah, well, that makes sense, and it would be good, and people like it. It's popular. It's quite a vote winner. People go, that's good. We want that, you know. But when you get to a point where you've got like some beef between like a PM that the guy in the Treasury doesn't like, and the Treasury has usually got a person in it who would quite like to be the PM, that sometimes also they said to me, there can be a problem getting it over the line, not only because the Treasury says, no, we can't afford it, we don't want to spend the money on that, but actually also because maybe there's a bit of an argument going on where they don't want to let somebody like Boris Johnson come forward with a policy that is going to be a massive vote winner and gain him a huge amount of support and success. So actually, it doesn't work in those terms. And I remember talking to this person who was like, I can't remember, they were like working a sort of political think tank policy space stuff. And I was just like, so one of the reasons why we're not taking the easiest, most obvious and constructive and job creating steps to deal with this problem is because there's two blokes having a fucking pissing contest behind closed doors and undermining each other because politics is based on a popularity contest. And actually it's more important to them to, like, you know, do each other's campaign damage or something like this. And, you know, I don't obviously know whether that's correct, but it's very easy to believe that that person telling me that story was telling me a true story, just because you look at the state of things in Westminster and it's like, oh yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if that does happen, you know. And so the rational basis for all this stuff, and just to go back to 1.5, the rational conversation that you want to have about 1.5 or 2 or what we're doing about it or what we're doing about the fact we're not doing it seems inherently like impossible to exist in that kind of environment in politics, right? So, and that's before you even give the oil companies the biggest seat at the table. Yeah. So there's these inherent problems with the governance system, and then there's corruption on top of that, on top of those problems. So yeah, it's not fit for purpose. It's no coincidence that we're always advocating citizens' assemblies, and we keep on coming back to them because they do help bypass these real problems with our governance systems. There was just one other thing I wanted to talk about with the carbon capture and storage in 1.5 before we end today. When we think about carbon capture and storage, whether that's direct air capture out of the air or putting scrubbers on factories so we can catch their emissions, it's always talked about within the framework of net zero. So in other words, we'll carry on emitting, or we'll not shut down hard to abate sectors where it's really difficult to get rid of the emissions. But then we'll use carbon capture and storage to offset these emissions that have to remain, and so we'll balance it out at zero. But this, for me, is really, really dangerous and completely the wrong way to think about it, because it's not our emissions that are the problem. The problem is the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and they're already too high. Yeah. So we could continue emitting and then use negative emissions to stabilize emissions at zero, therefore concentrations remain stable in the atmosphere at a level that is way too high. In reality, we have to get them back down to a safe level. We're at 420 parts per million now. We need to get that down to 350.
So rather than continuing emitting and then doing negative emissions, we need to stop emitting
and then do negative emissions
to get them down to zero.
Yeah.
Net zero will stabilize us at concentrations that are far too high. We need to be aiming for net negative, not net zero. And in other words, all our carbon capture technology and nature needs to be, we need to think of using them in the concept of negative emissions and drawing down atmospheric concentrations, not stabilizing emissions at zero.
Well, and it's really important point that got raised when that announcement was made, actually, that we had a citizens' assembly on climate in the UK, and I'm sure we'd agree that having a citizens' assembly that looks at how to do 2050 isn't sufficient. There are lots of things I would criticise about that assembly, and still, you know, there are a really long list of recommendations that came out of it where ordinary people sat around and got educated on the issue and went, oh shit, what should we do? And by far the most popular way to do anything negative was to do things like restoring peatlands because they're the best natural carbon sink on land, you know, not destroying life in the ocean and undermining that as a carbon sink. You know, some people's research think that we've reduced the capacity of the world's oceans to draw down carbon by about 1/3 because we've just fucking killed them off so much, and because it's getting hotter and because it's getting more acidic. So, you know, when people look at the information about what's happening and what you can do about it, it's like, I think people, we need to, as a movement, definitely become better at looking at the assemblies that have happened. You know, the citizens in France came up with a huge list of very good recommendations from their Citizens' Convention. The People's Plan for Nature Citizens' Assembly that happened, which was, you know, civil society set up to talk about what to do about biodiversity. And the Climate Assembly UK, as imperfect as we might think some of those have been, there's actually, we've already done the analysis on the popularity of these kinds of policy approaches when people don't have that popularity sort of metered out to them in tabloid sort of pantomime style in front of you know, in front of no facts, basically. But when people sit down and they do have facts and they do have a spectrum of presentations and information given to them, we actually have got tons of sort of very credible process that cost a fortune to put together and did involve randomly selected members of the public. And what they come back and say is, actually, we don't like the idea of nuclear very much. It's not very popular. I'm not saying that because I'm whatever, but, you know, it's not a popular energy solution. You know, people don't like the idea of carbon capture and storage. They much prefer the idea of insulating homes, you know, restoring nature, protecting peatland, blah, blah, blah. So, you know, I think we need to be much better at looking at what comes out of these processes, because it would be a great opportunity, right, for the movement to say, actually, the things that come out of these processes are things that we would advocate for, because we advocate for the process, but also because, what a surprise, turns out when people sit down and look at good information, they come out with good ideas and we agree with them and we go, well, this is why we trust ordinary people to make better decisions than politicians, right, about these policies.
So that assembly, the Climate Assembly UK, you're right that there was, you know, natural negative emissions technologies, if you like restoring nature, were much more popular than carbon capture and storage. But they did specifically ask about carbon capture and storage, and I think it had something like 40%, maybe 42% approval. It was not popular at all. But that just shows just how bad some of these decisions are when it comes to our climate policy. You know, this carbon capture and storage policy, it's, if you ask anybody that knows about what needs to be done for the climate, it's really low on the list of priorities, because it's not got that higher potential, and it's also really expensive. For every ton of carbon you save, that's a really expensive ton of carbon compared to other things you could have done, right? So it doesn't work. It's expensive. It's not popular. Like literally nobody wants this except oil and gas companies, and
the people who are going to build it,
which is
and maybe a handful of people.
It's oil and gas companies that are going to run it, yeah. But it's a tiny proportion of people pushing these, and yet this is the policy that got chosen, and it got chosen because our system is corrupt. There was a very interesting DeSmog analysis, real investigative journalism, where they demonstrated the amount of lobbying, the number of times the ministers had met with people lobbying for carbon capture and storage. And we use these words like lobbying and gifts and favours. The newspapers always talk about the gifts and favours that politicians receive. It's, if we were talking about African politicians, we would use the word corruption. And this is what it is. This is corruption. When we talk about corporate lobbying, we are talking about
bribery, yeah.
Private interests of the tiny minority of very, very wealthy people using their wealth and power to get access to politicians that you and I don't have, either as citizens or as members of civil society organisations. Ministers don't meet with campaigners, but they do meet with corporate lobbyists, and we end up with really, really bad decisions made. And this isn't some, any old moment in human history. This is a planetary emergency. The decisions made this decade will have impacts for thousands and thousands of years to come. They will affect everybody that comes afterwards. And here we have our government making an unjustifiable decision that that is wrong on 5 or more levels. It's completely shocking. We cannot hope to get out of this planetary emergency if our governance systems have been captured by the people that don't want anything to change. Yeah. It's as simple as that.
Yeah. And I suppose for me, just if I could say something to sort of close and frame what I think this 1.5 conversation and the CCS and all of that kind of stuff really says to me anyway, is the fact that we're in a process of sort of eternal avoidance of really confronting the reality of how much has to change. The fact that we have got this big statement from the British government, which is going to also travel a lot, it's going to really sort of say to a lot of people in the world, well, Britain are doing that, so maybe everyone can just bolt stuff onto industry and carry on. It feels to me like that unfolding at the same time as we've got 12 months worth of more of being past what most of us think of as the limit that we should have stopped at. And at the same time now fossil fuel companies basically saying, well, you hate us anyway, so we're just going to admit now that that's all we do is fossil fuels. We're doubling down on fossil fuels. We're moving away from all the things that we did, which were basically a waste of money, that we were happy to waste money on to look like we were trying out some other stuff, but we're not really bothered about doing. So we're just going to then, the mask comes off, we'll double down. You hate us, but you also can't beat us, so fuck you. And all of that stuff happening all at the same time, whilst we're watching, things like the international negotiations sort of seemingly not be able to carry us anywhere. It does to me feel like we're in a period of where there's a greater need for collaboration, social movements to help people understand, situate themselves in this kind of fairly complex set of voices and messages and conflicting ideas that can make it quite hard for people to sort of orientate themselves, I guess, in this time. And for me, the the clarity and the community and the cooperation and the non-violence that flows through XR and flows through the rest of the climate movement that I know, it feels to me like it's, I don't know, like it's more needed than ever, basically, because we're just going to have these conversations with each other in different ways, because they don't really make it into the public discourse through politics, through the media, watching what's happening in the courts. It's down to you guys. And that means that we need to not only carry on, but also like think very, very carefully about how we amplify these critical views and messages, and help people really situate themselves in the present in a way where they can actually think about what is theirs to do at this time.
Yeah, you're right. I think it is more critical than ever. I think it feels like things are on fast forward at the moment, and I liked what you were saying about the mask slipping. It feels like people were playing along a bit with us and saying, yeah, you're right, we will do something, and now they're turning a bit more, actually, fuck you, no, we won't. So it does make our movement more important than ever, and more important, not just for bringing about change, but more important for being there for each other. I think it's really fucking depressing to realize that nobody is actually looking out for your interests, and we're being led in the wrong direction, and you can't rely on your governments to look out for you. What we can rely on is each other, and that's something I think that's really, really valuable about social movements. We don't just push for change, but we support each other through it as well.
Yeah.
Quite a lot of heavy stuff in this episode, as always, but that is a nice note. I think we are not just here to talk about all the awful stuff that's going on. We're here to resist it as well. So join us in the resistance.